All right, everyone. Welcome in the course on Oceans and Human Health. I'm Professor Jana Asselman, and this is Miss Silke Lambert. She's the teaching assistant for this course. So together, the two of us are your main contact persons if there's anything you want to ask. All lectures will be recorded. They are recorded via Teams, via the speaker here. So the quality is not optimal, but we try to do our best with the equipment we have. There's still 2 seats. You may have to split up. One technical remark, there is no doorknob on the inside of this door. So we will leave the lock open so the door doesn't fully close. If you go to the restroom or go out, please ensure that, because otherwise we are locked in here and I have to call for help to get us out. So with that, welcome to Oceans and Human Health. Yeah. So now I need to switch, my apologies, screens. So why do we have a course on oceans and human health? Why is it important to talk about the interactions between oceans and human health? Well, if we look at where people live, we see that most of the people live in coastal areas. 40% of the global population lives in less than 100 kilometers from the coast, even though coastal areas only cover 4% of the Earth's surface, while the oceans cover 72% of the Earth's surface. And if we look at some of the major metropoles, most of them, with the exception of a few others, are located in coastal areas. The ones that are not are often located close to a river. So even then, blue space plays a prominent role in where people have decided throughout history to start a life. It's often one of the reasons why people like coastal environments. You're gonna have to take a chair and squeeze in a little bit on the tables. This course is very popular this year, so the classroom is a little bit too small. I'll have to ask for a bigger one next year. Coastal cities are therefore at the heart of oceans and human health because they interconnect human health, marine environmental health, or ocean health, as well as the economy. And in the next couple of courses, this is what we want to focus on. We want to focus on how to balance the interactions between our health, the environmental health, as well as the economic activities that we're doing. So when we talk about health, we also talk about a very broad definition of health. You have physical health in the strictest sense of the word, associated with illness, with disease. You also have mental health, spiritual health, and social well-being. While the other 3 are mainly at the periphery, we will touch upon some small aspects of them in this course. Why? Because we think it's important for you to get a holistic, transdisciplinary interpretation of health, and also because some of these health factors are also related to environmental health. And so we want you to really get that holistic overview of what oceans and human health is. So how is this course organized? All material is distributed via before. What you see is what you get. You get the slides. The slides are a summary of what I present. Not everything that I say is on the slides, but everything that I say is, of course, in the lecture if you're present, and we do record the lectures for students who are ill or who are unable to attend due to other overlapping courses. So please take additional notes either in class or when listening to lectures. Then we also have what we call blended learning. Blended learning means that in the even weeks, we have several discussion sessions. These discussion sessions are 1 hour only, but they also require some preparation. They are 1 hour only, meaning the 2 other hours that you usually spend in a theory lecture needs to be spent individually preparing the discussion session at your own pace. The material for the blended learning will become available roughly on Wednesday or Thursday before the Monday of the discussion session. Usually it consists of quizzes, of some papers or some movies to read or to watch, as well as some key arguments that you need to prepare. Why do we ask you to prepare? These discussion sessions are there for a reason. They are here to discuss and to interact. They are your practice sessions for the oral exam. The final exam consists of a written part on the theory lectures and an oral part on the discussion sessions. So take full use of the discussion sessions, because there you will learn what kind of depth, what kind of answers I expect from you during the oral exam. They're basically a training for the oral exam. There is also some suggested reading available through Fora, and as the name says itself, it's suggested reading. It's for students who want to explore some topic in a little bit more depth, but it's not mandatory. We have several parts in the course. The first part is a general introduction, as well as a blended learning session. Blended learning sessions are indicated in blue. The exact timetable for each of the sessions is on Fora. We then have a second part on ocean resources and human health, as well as 2 blended learning sessions. We then have 3 theory lectures by Professor Janssen focusing on negative interactions, mostly between oceans and human health, as well as 2 blended learning sessions. Part 4 is an individual project assignment. More information will be available on that on Fora in due time. So as you can see, all of these blended learning sessions together, they're only 10 weeks, which means that part 4, the project, you will do in week 11 or 12. Everything is included in the contact hours. The 2 times 3 hours you don't have lectures is the time you need to spend on the project. Nothing more. If you want to work 6 hours on the project, that's perfectly fine, but you can do it, well, it has 2 parts. You can do part 1 in 3 hours and part 2 in 3 hours. The blended learning, as I said already, there will be papers, there will be knowledge quizzes, there will be Q&A sessions. So participation is mandatory. Why? Evaluation. So 50% is the end of term assessment. It's the examination, the written examination of your lecture notes, personal notes, plus the papers of the blended learning. 50% is on continuous evaluation, which means your participation in the Q&A sessions, as well as the project, both the project submission, which we'll do in week 11 and 12, as well as your oral exam on the project during the exam itself. You'll see throughout the course that in blended learning and in the project, I will ask you for some ideas, some preparation, give arguments of X or Y. Feel free to use ChatGPT. I would even encourage you to use ChatGPT if you don't feel particularly creative. However, use it well and use it wisely. I always ask you to prepare some references from papers as well. I know ChatGPT is able to give you references, but if you use references, make sure you read them, you know that. Because during the discussion sessions and during the oral exam, I will say, hey, you looked at paper A, please explain me what they did in that figure. So feel free to use it, to the best of its abilities, but understand yourself what you have written, read the references that ChatGPT provides you, or find new ones. Because if you don't, I will know anyway, and you will fall through. And then, of course, when you fall through, it's not a good grade. So if you use it well. It's there for you to help you. I also use it in projects when I have to prepare something, but realize its limitations and realize that you need to understand it yourself because you need to explain it yourself. Any questions on course content and organization before we continue? Everything of this information is also available on Eufora, and I will put in announcements on Eufora whenever new content, new slides, new blended learning is available. I don't give too much information on the project because I don't want you to start too early on it. It's no use because you can only start on it once you've seen all the theory lectures anyway. And you have sufficient time within the course hours that's allocated for that in week 11 and week 12. So no need to worry about that with regards to time as well as other assignments. If there are no further questions, then let's dive in. So what is oceans and human health? Within the field, we study the complex and substantial interactions between the marine environment, oceans and seas, its ecological status or its health, and human health and well-being on the other hand. We basically ask ourselves the question, how do changes in the marine environment and its ecological status affect our health and well-being? And the why and the interactions are important. This is not a course that you'll have to study by heart. This is a course focusing on understanding and depth. For some cases, particularly for the written part, there will be general, broad answers, but do think about giving sufficient depth to your answers. At the end of every lecture, I always give some examples of exam questions, and do take notes of them and also the depth of the answer that's required. Try to not stay on the surface, but really go into the depth of the material without studying everything by heart. For the oral exam, there is no right or wrong. It's about your arguments and how well you can substantiate your arguments with literature, with things you have learned during this course. Why do people want to live by the ocean? Well, it's because the ocean provides so many things for us. It provides 50% of the world's oxygen. It plays a key role in climate regulation. And most of these processes, the people who have followed or who are following applied marine ecology will learn there about them. We will not focus on those roles in this class. In this class, we'll focus on the human interactions, the direct human interactions, because oceans provide a major transportation route. Think of the impact the blocking of the Suez Canal had on our global economy and the goods that were available to us in Europe because of one single shipping channel that was blocked. Recreation, whether it's going to the beach, water sporting, whale watching, the ocean provides a very large economic sector of tourism. In general, the ocean economy is quite big, amounting to almost 300 billion US dollars, employing almost 3 million people. Of course, it's also a source of food, fish being the most well-known one, but particularly in other countries, particularly in Asian countries, seaweed is a very vital ocean food source as well. Medicines. Not many people know this, but we get quite some of our novel medicines from the ocean. We'll talk about some examples and why that's so important next week. And when we talk about the blue economy or the ocean economy, we talk about all economic activities linked to oceans and coasts and seas in the broadest sense of the word. Established industries are fisheries, shipping, ports, transports, but also offshore oil and gas, dredging. Belgium, one of the major exports of the big dredging companies, such as Jan de Nul and Demi, but also emerging industries. Because our fish stocks are declining, we're moving more towards aquaculture. Because oil stock is decreasing and because fossil fuel is not so sustainable, we're moving to novel sources of energy, offshore wind energy, but also wave and tidal energy. Marine biotechnology, but also safety and surveillance. Why safety and surveillance? Why is safety and surveillance important? For example, if you take a look at the Belgian part of the North Sea, why would that be important? Does anybody have an idea? In the Belgian part of the North Sea, and particularly under the seafloor, there's currently 3 of our major telecom internet cables. Within the conflict with Russia, there are Russian ships outside and inside the Belgian part of the North Sea. They know where those cables are. The Department of Defense has calculated that should the Russians hit one of those cables, riots in Brussels would start 30 minutes after the cable got hit. Riots at the level that the army wouldn't be able to control. There's not only telecom cables there, there's also major energy cables for the offshore wind farms. So far, we still have in Belgium quite some nuclear plants, as well as some gas installations to cover that power. But we're thinking of building new offshore winds to get us free from nuclear energy. Well, if those cables get hit, the light goes out. So safety and surveillance at sea is becoming increasingly important in global conflicts. Think about what happened when the pipeline was sabotaged in the Baltic Sea. Oil prices went up, it disturbed the European economy. The Belgian part of the North Sea is using digital communication, satellite imaging to track the movement of every single vessel in our territorial waters to ensure that our cables and all the communication at sea is safe. In the Belgian part of the North Sea, we also have an area called the Paardenmarkt. It's an old munition dump site that we'll talk about in some of the blended learning parts. It contains still active munition from World War I and World War II. It contains bombs with Clark, with sulfuric mustard gas that are buried under the soil because at that time we didn't know what to do with them. We do not know what would happen if a major shipping vessel would crash into the Paardenmarkt. It would be likely not only an ecological, but also a human health disaster. Again, safety and surveillance at sea is important. And it's important because there's so many things we do at sea, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong in the harsh environment that is oceans and seas. Particularly in the North Sea, where everything is very close together, where you have a lot of sandbanks, where shipping channels are extremely narrow. So as I already mentioned, the ocean economy brings a large economic value. And if we look at fisheries and aquaculture already alone, produce about 100 billion US dollars a year. With 260 million jobs, only 5 million in Europe. Why? Because in most developing countries, aquaculture and fisheries are one of the primary sources of income. So while in Europe, it's okay, in developing countries, in most cases, the entire livelihood of specific coastal communities depends on access to the ocean economy. Yes, they get their food from the ocean, but they also get their jobs and their livelihood from the ocean. So in those communities, if the ocean economy is under stress because of storms, because of climate change, because of pollution, people lose not only their food source, but also their income, with major impacts and spillovers, of course, on health and well-being. So the entire positive interactions between environmental health, human health, and economy is under threat because of a variety of factors listed here. Because when the system works well, we get natural products, medicines, storm protection, ecosystem services, clean water, recreational opportunities. But when the system doesn't work well because it's disturbed, the pollution, temperature, extreme weather, loss of biodiversity, everything the ocean provides for us comes under stress. And as a consequence, this will spill over to our health in the narrow or the broadest sense, depending on the impact. And that's what ocean and human health is about. There is a very nice project that actually put every possible interaction leading to longer, healthier lives or increased mortality and morbidity to different types of ocean services. And I wanted to put this here to illustrate the complexity, but also to really focus on this. It's really about our health. It's really about longer, healthier lives versus increased mortality or morbidity. So when we talk about ocean health or when people talk about marine biodiversity, what I want you to take away from this course is the severe implications that can have also for our health if we don't maintain a good environmental status. You likely already heard a lot about the Sustainable Development Goals. You've seen it in several courses. Well, in addition to the Sustainable Development Goals, we also have the United Nations Decade of Ocean Science. We're right in the middle of it, and just like the Sustainable Development Goals, it's listing some key targets for the ocean. Here we are, there's 17 of them. And for the large majority of them, we can make a substantiated connection to oceans and human health. When we think about no poverty, we think about the jobs the ocean economy can provide. When we think about zero hunger, we think about food, and particularly fish food, as a major source of animal protein in developing countries. Life below water is an obvious one, and climate action as well, as the ocean is a major driver in climate regulation. Affordable and clean energy. Think about offshore wind energy. And the Ocean Decade is nicely linked to these different targets. It talks about a clean ocean, a healthy and resilient ocean, a productive ocean, a predicted ocean, because of course, the better we can predict our ocean in terms of storms and floods, the better we can protect or anticipate our coastal seas. A safe ocean, an accessible ocean, and an inspiring and engaging ocean. So you see, at a policy level, there's an increasing vision and need to really substantiate the different types of services the ocean provides and how this links to oceans and human health. Basically, this figure. So let's take a closer look into some of the ecosystem services. There's 4 major types of ecosystem services. We have provisioning ecosystem services. As the word it says, it goes about ecosystem services that provide things. Sand and gravel. Coastal areas are the major sources of sand winning. Harvestable seaweed. They also provide energy, they provide fish. Basically, it's about the provision of goods. Supporting services are benefits from the sea or from the ocean that supports our lifestyle. Think about nutrient recycling. Think about the water cycle in its broadest sense. A habitat for the fish we eat, but also the food web. Regulating services. What does the ocean help us regulate? Carbon storage, storm protection, waste breakdown, sediment stabilization, and finally, cultural services, which are mainly related to tourism and recreation, wildlife watching, creativity and art, and also well-being. This is a very important figure. Throughout the rest of the lecture, we'll be giving some examples of this figure. Usually, one of my exam questions is always about a key example of an ocean economy service and give me the different types of services it provides. Please don't learn this figure by heart. And what I mean with that, please don't memorize that provisioning is on the left and cultural is on the right. When I prepare my exam questions, I put in this graph by heart. And sometimes that means that provisioning is on the left top. Sometimes it means it's here. I don't do this to irritate you. I do this because I do it by heart. And sometimes provisioning is the first one that pops up. And sometimes supporting is the first one that pops up. And still I see students thinking, okay, it's provisioning, supporting, regulating, and culture. Don't do that. You're fooling yourself. Understand what they mean, think of some key examples, but where they are in the scheme really doesn't matter. So let's take a closer look at aquaculture. As I already said, it's one of the most important sources of animal protein, particularly in the least developed countries. 97% of the world's fishermen live in developing countries. Yet, we have a problem. 80% of the world's fish stocks are fully exploited or overexploited, which means that over the past few decades, the capture fisheries has stagnated. What has significantly increased to almost 50% is aquaculture. Whether it's onshore, whether it's offshore, it's increasing. Whether it's fish or any other species, if we talk about protein from the sea, aquaculture will be the major source of food in many different countries, both developing and developed countries, for the next decades to come. So let's take a closer look at aquaculture. Marine and brackish, when we talk about aquaculture in estuaries, is about 40% of the global aquaculture. Yet it is increasing. It's increasing at a higher pace than freshwater aquaculture. Why is that? What's the big difference between the availability of freshwater and the availability of marine water? You have much more marine water. Much more marine water than you have freshwater. And because you have much more and because the ocean is much bigger, things dilute quicker in marine water. So whether it's pollution from the industry or from something else, or from your own farm, in a marine environment, the impact will always be smaller because the dilution is bigger. So the growth potential of marine and brackish aquaculture is much higher. A second reason has to do with the use. We use fresh water also for drinking water, which means that when we talk about freshwater aquaculture, it always competes with other sources, such as using it for drinking water or using it to irrigate our crops when we talk about agriculture. We don't use, or we hardly use, seawater to irrigate our crops. We hardly use seawater to make drinking water. We do it in some regions, such as the Middle East, but it's highly intensive, and we do it there because there's literally no fresh water. But in most cases, marine and brackish aquaculture are preferred over freshwater because there's more and because it comes in less conflict with the other foods and water sources we use the water for. There's 4 primary groups: mollusks, seaweeds, finfish, and crustaceans. Each of them have their different peculiarities depending on what you want to use for them. The onshore versus offshore is better. And what you can see here is the major organisms produced in mariculture in 2018. It's more or less the same. So you can see there's a lot of red seaweeds in there. You have a lot of brown seaweeds as well. We have some oysters and clams. And only somewhere in the middle do we actually have Atlantic salmon. The only fish actually in this list. So when we look about, or when we think about marine aquaculture, it's mostly invertebrates or plants rather than fish. And we see particularly that seaweeds, as well as crustaceans, are increasing in their production. And the reason why these types of cultures, as well as seaweeds, are very prominent or are increasing is because of those ecosystem services. Here you see the same figure, but specifically applied to the case study of aquaculture. On the exam, I can give you a different case study. I can say, okay, let's try to fill in the scheme for an offshore wind farm, for a shrimp farm, for a seaweed farm, etc. So when we talk about aquaculture, the first thing it provides, of course, most obvious, provides food. But it also provides raw materials. Some of the shells are recycled in building construction. We'll see about that, or we'll learn more about that in the blended learning session. It's about valorization of waste streams. Also, some seaweeds are particularly harvested for what we call their bioactive compounds, because we use them for pharmaceutical potential. A major Korean seaweed called Ecolonia has been discovered as one of the potential seaweeds or bioactive metabolites that has potential, or is the only one with potential for Alzheimer's disease. Regulating. When bivalves grow their shell, what they actually do is they sequester carbon. Shells of bivalves of mussels is, of course, made of calcium. And in doing that process of making the shell, they're able to store carbon. Most bivalves, if not all, are filter feeders. And by the process of filter feeding, they actually denitrify the water and actually also remove some of the toxicants. they will remove microplastics from the water. Of course, they end up in your muscle instead, which may compromise their quality as a food, but still the plastics that will ultimately be in your muscle will be much, much smaller than the plastic you will get from any type of food package. Organisms such as oysters and mussels, they mostly grow on the sediment, they grow on the groins, they grow on stones, and they lead to mussel beds and oyster beds. Mussel and oyster beds will lead to sediment stabilization, which is important because if you stabilize the sediment cannot be washed away. If you think about the Belgian coast, for example, we have a nice sandy beach. Well, after every winter in springtime, they need to replenish the sand because the sediment isn't stabilized. If you add more mussel and oyster farms, the sand will be washed away less, and you will need to invest less in replenishing your sandy beaches. Because they create an irregular surface on the seafloor, they also help attenuate or dampen waves. If your waves are dampened, the impact of storm and extreme weather events on your coastal cities is much smaller. These are examples of regulating services. Habitat and supporting services. Quite some aquaculture, whether it's seaweed or whether it's an oyster bed, they provide shelter. They provide shelter where other organisms can hide. Fish can hide between seaweed forests. Or small starfish can actually hide between mussel shells. They are also often used as a source of food for fish populations. If, and this is a big if your aquaculture farm offshore is managed well, meaning it's a nice heterogeneous species culture, you will lead to increased gene flow with the wild populations. Of course, if you're doing like we do on land, if you're culturing only one type of mussel extensively on a large ocean surface, then you're creating a monoculture. And we all know from land that monoculture isn't leading to the most diverse populations. And finally, cultural ecosystem services. They provide employment and lifestyle opportunities. They provide tourism. Of course, think about seafood restaurants, seaweed restaurants, local areas that profit from the increased availability of aquaculture in their regions. Mollusks. So now we're going a little bit more into depth into the different trophic groups. So mollusks are bivalves. 80% of them are currently being produced in China. In addition to food, they're also used as materials in fertilizers, constructing materials, particularly the shells, multigrids, and to some extent for the extraction of pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals. However, not always. Why is there a risk, or why is there a caveat in pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals? Why can you not always use your aquaculture crop? What would be the constraints about using something that you've cultured at sea in a pharmaceutical or a nutraceutical? What are the requirements of a pharmaceutical product? It needs to be pure. It needs to be of highly consistent quality. And those two factors sometimes make it challenging, because when you grow things in the field, whether it's at sea or whether it's even in a pond, you do not always have full control of your system, which means sometimes the nutrients are diluted because there's extra rain, or they're extremely concentrated because we have influx of a discharge event. There can be an oil spill that affects your aquaculture farm. There can be a heat wave that causes organisms to grow better or worse. So production, when we do aquaculture offshore, is always highly variable, making it okay for food, but risky for pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals, which require consistent product quality. Another reason is the pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals we get out of, whether it's seaweeds or bivalves, they're often secondary metabolites. Secondary metabolites are produced by organisms in function of growth, in function of particular environmental conditions. So if they vary too much, the production of your secondary metabolite will also vary a lot. Hence, while it's interesting to get pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals from marine organisms, getting them from an aquaculture farm at sea is challenging because all of those varying conditions. So there's two options we can then do if we really want a specific seaweed or mussel metabolite, because we think it's a very good cancer drug or it's a very good Alzheimer drug. There's two things we can do. Does anybody have an idea on what we could do if we really want a metabolite from a mussel in pure, consistent quality? First thing we can do, we can culture it in a closed system on shore. We can culture it in a stable aquarium, constant light. We have full control of the life cycle, constant temperature. We know the water that goes in, the nutrient that goes in. We can perfectly fine-tune it, leading to stable quality. Very good way. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging because these are organisms. People who have an aquarium at home know that even them, fish or other organisms, can be a bit tricky to grow. They don't grow that well in an artificial environment, and they often need interactions with species. So the second option we can do, which is the more biotech option, is we can try to isolate the gene that actually is responsible for that secondary metabolite, and we can integrate it in an organism that's much more easier to grow in the lab. Think about a bacteria or a yeast, and we can just put the gene in a cloned bacteria or yeast and make it into a fermentation product and a big bioreactor, leading to the pure metabolite being produced by modified yeast or modified E. coli. They are now doing that already for insulin, for example. Provisioning ecosystem services, we have the food production, and then cultural ecosystem services, we have heritage as well as local education. Supporting, I mentioned it already, the increased seabed roughness, and you can see it here very well. We often don't like it when we go to the coast when there's mussel beds, because it hurts. It hurts when you walk into the sea. The shells hurt under your feet, but actually it's the best thing for an ecosystem if there's a lot of roughness on the sea floor. It also provides a nice habitat. You see here some starfish as well, some hard substrate, basically. And so it's often an indirect economic benefit to other services such as increased fish or invertebrate production. Hard substrate. Hard substrate is preferable because the mussels can grow and can attach to them. With everything that's going on in the ocean economy, What are we now doing in our oceans increasingly in the past 10 years that will lead to a lot more hard substrates? What will we be doing in Belgium as well in our North Sea that will lead to more hard substrates in the North Sea? What will we build there? Windmills. We will be introducing windmills. There's different ways of introducing them, but every single way that you put them in the North Sea or any other sea or ocean will lead to an increase in hard substrates. So what will happen, and what is already happening in those wind farms, is because of the increased hard substrate, you will have wild mussels, oysters, and other shellfish that will grow on those pylons of the windmills. And because of that, we now see increasing fish populations in those windmill farms. And that's often a co-benefit of those windmill farms. From what we can see so far in data of the Belgian part of the North Sea, and where we had the first windmill park, the Trontonbank, we now see that fish populations have increased, but the seafloor itself hasn't fully stabilized in the past 10 to 15 years. It's still fluctuating between an increase of hard substrate, increased growth, and the biodiversity is still going, it's fluctuating up and down, because we, of course, are moving from a soft sediment, a soft bottom floor, a sandy floor, to a hard substrate. We still don't know the long-term impact on the entire ecosystem, but on the fish population, it's positive, as well as providing much more opportunity for fish. So what will they do now in the new Princess Elisabeth zone in the Belgian part of the North Sea, where we will build new windmills? They said, as we build new windmills, the fishermen, particularly in Belgium, because our Belgian part of the North Sea is super small compared to other countries, are becoming angry because they lose space to fish. So they made the compromise to now, in the new Elizabeth zone, to grow mussels and oyster farms, because they know they grow well in the presence of windmills because of the hard substrate, and to compensate fisheries, and because we know fish stocks are declining, they can now do aquaculture in the Princess Elisabeth zone, or once the zone is established. Very nice idea in theory. There's a very big practical caveat to this. And I'm saying this just to show you the very transdisciplinary nature and complex interactions that are at play. You have a windmill farm, you have an aquaculture farm. Windmill farm require maintenance maybe twice a year, 3 times a year. When you want to harvest your aquaculture crop, you need often a smaller vessel to go pick up your crop. Whose fault is it if you crash into a wind turbine with your boat? Who's liable? Is it the fisherman? Or is it the windmill farm? Windmill farm says, hey, we're here first. It's a fixed structure. It can't move. It's your fault if you drive against it with your boat. Okay, says the fisherman. Yeah, that's the risk. I will take a nice insurance. But there's not a single insurance company in Belgium that wants to insure a fisherman to cover the costs when he hits a windmill farm. Because there's simply no idea on what the cost might be, because you have the cost to the windmill pylon itself. And if it's only slightly damaged and it can still function, that can be calculated. But if it's out of order, you need to be able to estimate the loss. Estimating the loss is not easy, because the loss also depends on the period that it's out of order. Was it windy or not? Because if it's out of order during a period that it's not even windy, it doesn't matter. If it's out of order during a windy period, it does matter. That's if he hits only the pylon. What if for some reason when he collects the nets or whatever, he hits one of the cables? Maybe not only one, but 2, 3, 4 windmills may be out of order. So having a clear assessment of costs, which is usually what insurance companies want, because they want to make a profit, is almost impossible in this case. Meaning not a single fisherman gets an insurance, and if they don't get an insurance, most of them don't want to take the risk themselves because there's a big risk. And so now, as in Belgium, as we are building this framework for what we call multi-use, using windmill parks also for aquaculture, we're also having to deal with the legal and insurance issues that are associated with it and how to build a framework for that. And the good thing is, the Belgian government said it has to happen together. So the windmill farms now also have the co-responsibility to make this happen. Because if they cannot create a legal framework for the fishermen to operate, they cannot build their windmill park. So it's one thing our government really did well. Because if they would put it independently, then the windmill farm would just say, not our problem, even better for us. They cannot use the area anyway, and it's safe. So what are the options that they are now looking into then? So some of the options they're now looking into is also training technicians of the windmill farms to collect the crops. Because the people of the windmill farms know how to navigate, know how to operate, or the other option is taking the fishermen along on the same boat, which is even a more sustainable option because it's one boat less, creates interconnection, it creates training of each other in the different processes. And so those are the things we're now dealing with proactively before it's even in place. And Belgium is the front runner in that. And I'll show you why. So this is our coastline with, you have Knokke, you have the Panne, you have Ostend in the middle, you have Zeebrugge, the major harbor somewhere here, and then you have here the Scheldt estuary to Antwerp. And our territorial waters have actually the same shape. The Trondheim area is now here. The Princess Elizabeth area will be roughly here. This is recreational waters. Think about sailing, water sports, yachting, boats. These are the major shipping channels that are dredged to have sufficient depth for the big shipping tanks to go either to Zeebrugge or the Scheldt estuary into Antwerp. This is the current zone for fishing. And this is roughly marine protected areas where conservation is important. So the first thing you can see here, it's full. We don't have space. We don't have a lot of space. So that's why, in contrast to on land, Belgium is a front runner in marine spatial planning. It's one of the first countries to have a dedicated marine spatial plan because we knew from beforehand. We have a very small zone. We have a lot of traffic coming from France, coming from Netherlands, coming from the UK that need to get in and get out with very big ships. We want to have windmills. We want to have fisheries. We want to have some tourism as well. And if we want to do all these things, well, we need to organize our marine space. We need to organize it in such a way that all of these economic activities can occur without conflicting or, particularly at sea, endangering each other. And there's a tiny caveat here as well, because here you still have the paardenmarkt, the munition dump site that's currently a no-go zone for anybody but the military because of the risks associated with it. And you see it's in a very inconvenient spot because it's almost right in front of the harbor of Zeebrugge, and it's currently blocking any further expansion of the harbor. The Belgian Marine Spatial Plan was actually first developed by the Ghent University professor, Frank Maas, from the Faculty of Law, and now is being applied not only in Belgium, but also even in Australia, for example, where they had a wide coastline and they never thought they would have any conflict, but they now realize, some windmill farms want to be close to the Great Barrier Reef. How do we deal with that, etc.? And they're looking to Belgian part of the North Sea as an example on marine spatial planning. So it's not an engineering challenge. It's not only a biological challenge or a sustainability challenge. It's also a legal challenge, particularly in territorial waters. And with that, I'm just going to finish this slide before we move to the algae. But before the algae, we will have a short break. So a final ecosystem services for bivalves is regulating ecosystem services. And we talk about the cycling of nutrients, as well as carbon sequestration due to the calcification process, as well as reduced rates of shoreline and bed erosion. When we talk about carbon sequestration, a study, it's not the most recent one, but it's the one that compared the different types of ecosystem, saw that particularly oyster beds are very good at sequestering carbon in compared to other ecosystems. So that's why they're now seen as a new way to sequester carbon. However, depending on the point of view of what is carbon sequestration, this is debated. Why? Because once you harvest the oysters, the carbon is stored in the shell. You bring the carbon back into the economy, and you're not truly sequestering it. So carbon storage through bivalves is done in the theoretical sense of the word, that it stores carbon. Whether it permanently sequesters the carbon from our ecosystem is debated. Another thing, or advantage or disadvantage, depending on how you look at it, is bivalves may bioaccumulate also pathogens. They may bioaccumulate it via mussels through humans by direct route, or indirect route is they might bioaccumulate it when they are eaten by fish or other higher organisms, leading to potential food safety risks. This is particularly true if we talk about, for example, harmful algal blooms that are also prominent in marine ecosystems, where we see a lot of accumulation of toxins. Think about paralytic shellfish poisoning, etc., that are generally accumulated in bivalves, and that are also often screened for when these crops are put on the aquaculture market. Again, this is only a challenge in offshore aquaculture. If you do it onshore with a well-managed system, you can rare, pretty, disease-free. There's some debate on what is a well-managed system, because some aquaculture farms see a well-managed system as, if I give sufficient amounts of antibiotics to my animals, they will not get sick. From a sustainable, economical, and even environmental point of view, that's not really the best course of action. Nowadays, they're investing a lot into probiotics as well as other strategies than antibiotics to ensure that you have healthy systems even onshore. And with that, I suggest we take a 15-minute break before we move on to the algae.